Okay, good morning, everybody. I hope everybody had a good weekend. I remembered this time to record stuff. If any of you were trying to watch the video, I apologize. The one that got posted was an old one for the last chapter. It's the same stuff, same but different. Okay, so we're down to the tail end, just a couple of chapters left. So we'll work on chapter 20 before the break today and Thursday. And then we will cover chapter 21 when we get back from the break. So this has all sorts of details and images of various types of ecosystems, and we'll go through and define that stuff as we move into this a little bit. But I think we can recognize when we, even just looking outside, we can recognize that there is variation that you might see here compared to going someplace maybe like Arizona or other areas that have differing types of vegetation, differing habitats, right? So ecosystems are varied. When we think about the biosphere, it's the planet with everything within that, the living and the non-living. So the biotic, the living, and the abiotic, the non-living, all of the things like nutrients that living organisms need to tap into, right? And so we're going to talk about the cycling of nutrients, some of the big players that are important for living organisms in the first place. We want to think about how those nutrients are able to move through an ecosystem, through living back to the non-living and back again, a cycle, right? And there are multiple players in this process that we will describe as we start moving through here, all right? So to start off with, we've got a couple of organisms, and this is, we're gonna see all sorts of things as we move through this presentation today. So butterfly and a lupin, both of these living in oak pine barren habitats in North America. So similar areas that both of these would call home. We will go through and show some details, like I said, of different types of habitats and some respective participants within there. So as we start moving through, I hope you recognize the tremendous variation that we can see. And we will also look in some details as we progress through, but you can see some of it right here. As we look at rainforest in Brazil, it's lush, full of vegetation. There are all sorts of different types of plants. That's what we're looking at there. But if we were to look closer, we could see tremendous variation with animals as well. There's a lot of participants in these types of environments. And then we look at the tidal pool in Maine, a smaller versus a larger ecosystem, and it looks pretty devoid of life. There's a lot of moss and algae within this, kind of hard to see, but other things, if we were to look closer, we could see within these tidal pools as well. There are things present, all right? But as we evaluate, as we look at ecosystems and try to make comparisons, we can recognize that they are very different, all right? Dependent upon the circumstances. And it also, deep down, really kind of depends on where they're at on the planet. The closer we are toward the equator, the greater amount of solar energy and greater likelihood to see tremendous diversity, like the rainforest image, as we see here, all right? So desert-like ecosystems also have variation, depends on where you're at. We can think of lots of Idaho as a semi-arid desert. We don't see giant saguaro cactus like we might see in some parts of Arizona, but we definitely can see some cactus. We see lots of sagebrush, right? The habitat that, you know, all of the different types of vegetation we see here, are kind of a mixture of different types that we will define here shortly. It's more than just desert-like. So here, two different deserts. We've got Arizona and Cape Verde, Africa. Very different appearing. This, although there's not tremendous diversity with the vegetation, there's a lot of plant life. There's lots of cactus. There's a lot of shrubs on the hillside. There's stuff growing. It's not dense with vegetation, but there are plants, right? And as we look at this desert in Africa, there's basically no vegetation, right? And you know, if we were to look at maybe measures of precipitation, that could be very similar in both of these environments, yet we see huge differences with that. When we look at more details about that, we might think about, well, what could this, each of these habitats, what sorts of animals might they be able to support? And in the Arizona, in the Saguaro Desert, the potential for numerous types of animals to call this area home, I think is tremendous. And then we look at the opposite image that's pretty devoid of any sort of vegetation. As far as the eye can see, it looks barren. The potential for lots of organisms to say, this is a great place to live, I think that's not going to happen, all right? It truly depends, all right? So when we think about all of this, we think about plants and we think about animals, we think about things like food chains, an idea of kind of who eats whom as we think about this. And we'll move through in a couple of slides down the road and show this in a little bit more realistic idea, because it's more than just a chain. I would hope you eat more than just one thing, right? You are consuming multiple things in a day, right? And when we think about this, lots of animals are tapping into numerous types of resources. It's more web-like than chain-like, right? And we'll show that in a second. But this is a good example to show this chain and also show the trophic levels. This is basically a measure of the available, the potential that this trophic level holds really for the next level. What sorts of nutrients or what sorts of energy is held within these levels, all right? So at the bottom of our chain are our producers, and it depends on the types of habitat. Here we're looking at an aquatic habitat, so we've got some algae. We could throw plants in if we're looking at a terrestrial habitat, all right? The producers are those that are making sugars. They're capturing the energy through photosynthesis, capturing that energy and converting it into carbohydrates. and other organisms tap into that stuff, right? So the producer is making the food, and then we look at multiple consumers, right? Things that are eating other stuff. The primary consumers eat the producers, right? And there are numerous examples of things that could be primary consumers. The mollusks here tapping into the algae, anything that's really eating these producers, we might think of as a primary consumer, right? When we see the web here in a minute, that's not necessarily always the case. You might have somebody up above that's tapping in and having a little bit of salad, all right? And that's okay, all right? But in this chain of events, we see a linear progression of nutrients moving through this ecosystem. So the mollusks feed on the algae. The sculpin feeds on mollusks, and then the salmon feeding on the sculpin. So the secondary consumer, these guys eat primary consumers. And the tertiary or apex consumer, well, they eat the secondary ones, all right? A chain of who's eating who, as I said a second ago, all right? There are all sorts of details as we look at this, and sometimes we may hit a handful of these levels more than just tertiary. Kind of depends, but usually we think of this. And at this apex, this top consumer, we might think of these as the predators in this type of an environment. If we're thinking terrestrial stuff, there are all sorts of animals that we might think of as an apex predator or consumer. We definitely fit in that category, all right? So there are all sorts of details as we look at this, and I'll show you an image here in a second when we start thinking about energy, all right? And how it flows through this system, all right? The algae or the plants, if we're thinking a terrestrial system, they get bombarded with solar energy, and they're able to take that energy and harness it and make some sugars. They grow, right? And they have some reserves that we in turn can tap into, right? So dependent upon the environment, maybe dependent upon how close you are to the equator, you may have a lot of producers, or we could look at some of those desert types of environments that may have very minimal types of producers. And that sets the stage for everything else above it. What sorts of resources are there? How many things can we be tapping into to provide nourishment for every level as we move up through there, right? And these energy levels or trophic levels basically look at what these specific steps hold within them. So here we flipped it around the other way and put the producers up here at the top instead of down at the bottom, but it's the same idea, right? And we can see down on the x-axis, the energy content. This is kilocalories per meter squared per year. So how much energy they are harboring. You truly don't need to know all of these details, but the energy, all right? A boatload, 20,000 kilocalories that are held within this square meter area, all right? So there's all sorts of producers. It's more than just the algae. There's diatoms, water lettuce, arrowhead, eelgrass, all sorts of aquatic vegetation because we're still looking at water, all right? So numerous things that we would call producers, things photosynthesizing. And in this square meter worth of area, there's quite a bit of energy that they harbor within that, all right? The first ones tapping into these primary consumers, there's a handful of organisms that feed on these producers. Turtles, snails, mullet, all sorts of things. Midge larvae, so insects feeding on these producers as well. Lots of things. These consumers that tap into the producers. And now you see the amount of energy, there's much less, all right? From 20, a little over 20,000 to about 4,000, all right? Calories, and these are calories that are available for the step below, all right? So we've grown, we've pulled in all of these nutrients, we've done all of that stuff, and then this is energy that's available to be tapped into. The next group, the secondary consumers, tapping into these guys, it's a handful of different types of fish, right? And some other stuff, some insects as well. Killifish, bluegill, sunfish, the four-leaf beetle, and water striders, water skippers, I like to call them. These guys, their bar is even less, right? At a few hundreds of calories that are available. And then we get to the top, the tertiary consumers, bass and gar and water snakes that might be tapping into these secondary guys, and even less, right? Very few calories available, right? And as we look at this figure, again, we're talking water, but we can think about it. It doesn't matter if we're talking aquatic or terrestrial habitats. When we look at the tertiary consumers, or the top predators in this ecosystem, the bars that we show are very low. There's not a tremendous amount. If we were measuring population size, there's not a tremendous amount of them. There's not a tremendous amount of energy that they hold within them for the next round, because they don't have as many resources to be tapping into. When we look at these trophic levels, they say it's about, and this is a little off, but about a 10% rule. So the producers maximize all of this energy from the sun, they produce stuff, and 10% of that will be converted into biomass for the next group. And they take in all of that. So in order to get to their adult size, whatever it is we're talking about in the consumers, they need to be consuming mass quantities in order to get to that size, right? And so 10% converted into the next, and 10% into the next. There's less and less as we move through there, as we move through the trophic levels, right? Tapping in to those resources. That's also why we don't, look outside and see things like mountain lions or grizzly bear all over the place, because there's not enough other things that they could be tapping into for their size, population size, to blow up into mass proportions, right? And we could think about humans and our population size with what we feel as if endless resources to be tapping into, right? That may potentially lend to mass quantities of people, right? So this image, like I said, start off with the chain and show a little bit of how that flows, but really it's more web-like, all right? There are numerous things that might be tapped into as foodstuffs. So we can see at the bottom, there's really a lower bottom. This is in the soil, but at the bottom are grasses. These are our producers. And we can see arrows going up into numerous primary consumers, things that will be tapping into the grasses or the seeds that the grasses are making, right? So the primary, or the producers, the primary consumers, we could move up to secondary, tertiary, and quaternary if we're moving through 4 layers of this, right? Or maybe just 2, right? It really depends, right, on these circumstances. We also can see arrows from every one of these, even really from the producers. I don't know if I've got any coming right off of the producers or not, but they do get broken down. Everything down here, these are all, this is the soil, and these are all organisms like bacteria and fungi that are classified as decomposers, right? They are still feeding on stuff, but they're feeding on the dead stuff, right? These dead organisms or their waste, right? The byproducts of all of these needs to get broken down. And the decomposers play a vital role in that. There's more than just that. We can see earthworms, mold, fungi, which are types of molds, and bacteria. There's a plethora of different organisms that help to take in these nutrients, the waste products, or the dead bodies of these animals, and they break them down. They take those nutrients and provide them back to our producers. So the roots of these plants have nutrients to tap into, and in turn, the consumers tap into those nutrients, and it follows through this web of events, right? So we can see all sorts of arrows, and the black arrows showing the movement, up these trophic levels from producers through consumers. And you can see our little mouse potentially getting tapped into by numerous animals, right? The same with the squirrel, right? Other birds down here maybe being fed on by birds, right? It truly depends. And we can see here with some insects potentially tapped in by other insects, birds, snakes, toads, whatever it might be, as it moves through. And then the darker or the lighter arrows moving down, bringing all of these back for the cycle to basically keep churning through, all right? Decomposers, all of these guys play a huge role in the cycling of nutrients, right? They are oftentimes forgotten when we think about stuff like this, and we really only think about this idea, plants moving through this system. But you've got to have the decomposers in order for it to function properly, right? Without them, it would be like, all of the trash collectors on strike and garbage would just pile up all over the place. Nothing would get dealt with, all right? It wouldn't get broken down, right? And those nutrients would be left unavailable for other organisms to tap into. And if the producers can't get that, well, then they can't grow. So there are all sorts of different types of environments and different things that we could think of as being able to be tapped into. So this is a hydrothermal vent deep in the bottom of the ocean, all right? And there are all sorts of things down here, some shrimp and lobster, mussels all over the place. And as we get clear down, meters down into the ocean, or a mile down there, there's virtually no light at all that's able to make its way down here. And so we don't see photosynthetic organisms. We see chemoautotrophic bacteria. These are bacteria that take minerals, things that they tap into that aren't using the sun. They tap into that to acquire energy to grow, right? So growing like on rock, on hydrogen sulfide that's being spewed out from these hydrothermal vents, they're able to utilize that and to grow. As these bacteria thrive, they in turn they are the producers, all right? They provide the nutrients needed for all of these others to tap into, and they consume them. And in turn, we have a nice food web without the need for any sort of photosynthetic organisms. But typically, when we think about these things, we think about some sort of photosynthesis happening. Photoautotrophs, using the energy from the sun to produce stuff. This is, minerals that are used instead. So we're kind of stuck in the water for a bit of this chapter, but that's okay. Here we're looking at, it's not trophic levels, but it kind of is, all right? There are all sorts of issues with contamination, with things that might get into a habitat. Doesn't matter if we're talking water or terrestrial, that might lend to cycling through that habitat and potentially amplifying as it moves through. So PCBs, these chemicals, bad news, right? And potentially contaminating waterways. There's all sorts of issues with them. Here we can see the levels, concentration in the dry weight of the organisms. And we can see nitrogen and nitrogen 15 enrichment on this x-axis. So as they are pulling things in, it ultimately, what we're trying to show is it compounds or increases as we move through a food web, right? Although it looks chain-like here, right? So phytoplankton, zebra mussels, these guys pulling in the PCBs, and in turn, other things start feeding on these producers, which in turn amplifies it, focuses it as we move up to the bigger tertiary consumers or wherever we want to take them. As we get to the top of the trophic level, something here like the walleye have been feeding on all sorts of things that have focused the PCB levels, and now you get high concentrations, right? There are other things like mercury that's an issue, and we think about things like big fish that have lived in these oceans for a long time, feeding on all sorts of things, having a greater capability of accumulating more of it over the course of their lifetimes. So tuna, as an example, can have very high levels of mercury as a result of this, as we see it focusing through the food chain, making its way into them, all right? That sets the stage definitely for some concern. Doesn't necessarily mean, but you can think about some of these things, eating smaller fish, eating different things, not that I want you to eat a bunch of suckers, but maybe, right? They potentially have far fewer amounts, concentrations of these chemicals because they're eating lower on that and not having the opportunity for it to focus through, right? So that truly depends, right? Depends on what you're eating. So as we think about water, there is a tremendous amount of water on this planet. 97% of it is salt water, right? There's only a very small amount of it that is fresh water, and with that, a smaller fraction of it that we can pretty easily tap into, right? So that sets the stage for other issues as we think about this, because water is vital for life, right? And it, depends on whatever, right? Whether it be salt or fresh water. But for us, we need this, right? So we can look at rivers and lakes, about a fraction of a percent, about 0.3%. Groundwater has the bulk of it, upwards of 30% that's underground soil moisture, swamp water, and permafrost, and then glaciers and snow cover making up almost 2/3, a little over 2/3 of that as we look at it, all right? And this is all the fresh water, all right? So little bit that we're tapping into, and others frozen away, at least right now it is. So we're going to see this picture repeatedly as we move through this chapter, but the title will change, all right? There are numerous things that will be cycling through the environment. and we'll show this picture to kind of show how things are moving, all right? So water is important as we see it cycling, right? The water cycle has all sorts of potentials where we might think about being able to tap into it, right? Or, well, maybe not, right? It depends. So there are numerous things that we might call reservoirs. And when we show water, I think of a reservoir as a body of water, right? The reservoir is a place where you might be finding these things. And talking water, well, that seems pretty apparent, but we'll talk about other nutrients and say, oh, the atmosphere is a reservoir for this. Carbon dioxide, the atmosphere is a great reservoir for carbon dioxide, all right? So water, as it cycles through, there are numerous places where we may find it. The ocean or bodies of water can be a mechanism. The atmosphere as well is a great potential to hold tremendous amounts of moisture. So water from the land and oceans gets into the atmosphere through evaporation or sublimation as it makes its way up into the atmosphere, cooling, condensing, collecting, and potentially falling back down as some sort of precipitation, rain or snow, right? This water can enter freshwater bodies and get into the soil, becoming part of groundwater, surface water, stuff that we potentially can tap into, all right? As the water from the oceans evaporates, it leaves the salt behind, and what we have is fresh water moving up into the atmosphere and coming inland. So cycling through, leaving the salt behind. The salt also makes its way into the ocean through erosion, bringing those substances into the big bodies of water as well. But through evaporation, we can focus and concentrate that as well, all right? So there are numerous things as we see water flowing and arrows showing this cycle as it moves through, all right? So we can also see with plants, evapotranspiration, where the plant itself, as it is photosynthesizing, can be losing some moisture and other potentials, right? So there's more. The carbon cycle, the arrows are a little different. We can see a good amount of carbon dioxide within the atmosphere. As I said a second ago, it is a great reservoir for that, all right? So we can see it, it's also dissolved in water, and there are issues with that where we can see acidification of the oceans as a result of CO2 accumulation. Photosynthesis converts the CO2 into organic carbon, basically taking that and building sugars out of it. Through metabolism, through our respiration pathways, we take that organic carbon, we burn through that, metabolizing it, and release carbon dioxide back into the environment as we blow it off as CO2 gas, as we exhale, all right? So long-term storage of carbon happens in matter. It happens in plants, it happens in living organisms, and it's also deep, very deep underground as we think of fossilization, as we think of oil reserves, hydrocarbons tied up, right? Volcanic activity and human activity brings some of these stored carbon reserves back up to the surface. And as we tap in to these oil reserves, we bring mass quantities of it back into this cycle, creating more carbon dioxide, spewing it out, then is able to be pulled in to this cycle. It's not balanced, right? So there are numerous things, arrows cycling through, and we can see a few with the photosynthesis pulling some of the CO2 and then through respiration blowing off some CO2. The same as we move to a terrestrial habitat with plants pulling it in and others consuming that and releasing CO2. Okay, I thought I skipped one for a second. Okay, so the nitrogen cycle, this is something that is super, not that the others aren't important, right? But nitrogen is super important for organisms. It is an important nutrient that provides building blocks for things like nucleic acids, as we think about that, or amino acids. As we are building proteins or our DNA and RNA, right? Nitrogen plays huge roles in this. It's something that is a common component in fertilizers to help ensure that the crops grow well, all right? We'll show phosphate, that's another potential as well, all right? Nitrogen is something that does play a vital role, and it's something that is a limiter when we think about plant growth. If you don't have ample amounts of nitrogen, your plants aren't very happy, right? So there are numerous things for the nitrogen cycle, and a lot of it relies on microbes, bacteria, right? Bacteria to pull in the atmospheric nitrogen, the N2 nitrogen gas. We breathe it all of the time, but we can't use it. It comes that we exhale it just as we inhale it, all right? Our bodies don't use that type of nitrogen, all right? Bacteria fix nitrogen and they pull it in from the atmosphere. There are numerous types of bacteria and they kind of work on it together to convert it into usable stuff for other organisms, all right? So by fixing the nitrogen, they tie it up and convert it into something that plants are able to tap into. And then as we think of the consumers, as they are feeding on the producers, that's where the nitrogen ultimately cycles through living systems, right? As we pull it in through those nutrients that the producers were able to acquire by the bacteria that converted the nitrogen into ammonia that the plants were able to deal with, right? So as we get back down more, we could flip it over to that web again where we were showing the decomposers. There are numerous bacteria that would fit within that category, and in the decomposition, we are going to take the nitrogenous wastes, we are going to convert that stuff, and by denitrification, we can release it as nitrogen gas back to the atmosphere, unusable, right? So it cycles through, and bacteria convert it into usable forms, and other bacteria break it down into unusable forms to cycle it through, to pump it back up into the atmosphere, if you will. They're not technically pumping it, but to release it into the atmosphere and for it to be tapped into elsewhere, right? So there's all sorts of cycling and organisms that play a role within this, all right? It provides the nitrogen for terrestrial and aquatic food webs, fertilizers, as we convert and build these ammonia compounds to spread onto our crops, also sets the stage for some potential issues as we see runoff making its way into bodies of water. We're doing more than just fertilizing the soil and our crops. We are providing fertilizers to aquatic systems, and that's maybe not the best situation. We oftentimes see a situation, we'll show some images of this in a second, but we call it eutrophication, which is basically like over nutrients, over or excessive amounts of nutrients added into an aquatic situation, and now you get big overgrowths of algae, which depletes the water of nutrients, depletes it of oxygen, and causes huge die-offs of fish, right, through this. And possibly some dead zones. We'll show some of that in a minute. Phosphorus, this cycle it's not as busy. There's not as many arrows going every which way, right? It's a little bit more simple, right? When we think about it. The reservoir for phosphorus is within the soil, right? Within rocks, it's tied up within this, and we can see it being released through erosion. Helps to release that, so dissolved in streams and lakes, making its way. It is also potentially released through volcanic eruption, so tied up within the rock, but released as aerosols and then coming back down within that ash. It's something that's not as accessible. It's not easily tapped into like the nitrogen is for bacteria help to deal with all of this stuff, all right? Tied up in the rocks, it's difficult. In order for plants to get it, it has to be like some sort of erosion, or maybe we take that upon ourselves, and through mining, we can take these rocks, crush them, and extract out the phosphorus. Thanks, Simplot. As we, right here in Pocatello, have phosphate plants. We're not in Soda Springs to see the phosphate mines, but that's ultimately what they're tapping into, right? And as they mine all of that, they basically take the erosion and deal with it on our own needs, right? Taking and crushing those rocks and pulling that phosphate out, right? And that in turn is incorporated into fertilizers. Things like ammonium phosphate that has the nitrogen and the phosphorus together. Those are both nutrients that plants need, all right? So fertilizers harbor it, the leaching of soil through erosion and runoff all have the potential to bring phosphorus into bodies of water. And this is another situation where we can see eutrophication, we can see problems. Right. The Portneuf River is, there are good parts and there are bad parts to the Portneuf River. There are parts of it that we are in the process of dealing with and hoping, like the concrete channel, to remove it and to bring it back to more of a natural type of river. There are areas of the river where we do all sorts of studies, right? Measuring different things within the water, looking at stuff like nitrogen, phosphorus, looking at coliform bacteria, so like gut organisms, things like E. coli. So there are all sorts of fingers that get pointed at who's doing this, right? Who's causing these problems, right? There are portions of the river where we can see high levels of phosphate, and it just so happens a lot of that is near Simplot, right? There's a lot of phosphate that potentially is right there within the rivers, right? Which they in turn, if you know where Simplot's at, the wastewater treatment plant is on the opposite side of the river, but they're pretty close to one another, right? And Simplot blames the waste treatment plant. They say that it's us. It's all of our stuff going down the drain. We're contributing all of these phosphates. We definitely play a role in that, all right? But I think a phosphate plant also, we should look at that a little more closely, right? There are some other issues, right? And we could definitely see in parts of the river, greater areas with some eutrophication, some nutrients getting spewed into the river. You probably have recognized some of the storm drains, some of the sidewalks with little fish painted on them that say, don't dump any waste. We drain right to the river, all right? That's a potential issue in the first place with all sorts of pollutants potentially going directly to the river, lending to other problems, all right? There was a graduate student that just defended her research month ago or so. And part of her research, maybe you guys saw some of these, there were a bunch of laundry baskets that were kind of all over, some of them around campus, but some of them all over town. We went to Edson Fichter Park last summer, and there were handfuls of them. I saw them in numerous places. I'm like, what in the heck is this? And then I learned what it truly was. She was collecting leaf litter, so the leaves as they're dropping, other stuff as well, but collecting stuff over the course of a year. So there are plants, there are trees that will flower, they drop the blossoms, there's other things besides leaves, right? Over the course of the growing season. And she wanted to evaluate what sorts of substances are potentially being released. And if you think about an urban situation, there are trees all over the place, dropping leaves into the gutter. And these things, some of it, those nutrients wind up in the river, right? And dependent upon time frames, there's various spikes with high levels of nitrogen or phosphorus or whatever, based off of the timing of the dropping of different plants. It all varies depending upon locations, the ways trees were planted. Were they all the same sorts of trees? Was there variation? The nutrients that are potentially released vary, right? And all of that, you know, we can think back to these cycles and how is it that things wind up in these specific areas. You oftentimes don't think issues with stuff like lawn clippings or leaf litter being something that impacts rivers and streams, but it does, right? And in an urban situation, you've got the potential for lots of issues with that. There are other issues, as we see here, with fertilizers and things like that. Agriculture plays a big role in causing problems where you have runoff and that makes its way into streams or rivers and causes problems. But other big problems are homeowners that want a nice lush green lawn and they dump mass quantities of fertilizer on there. They overwater, you get runoff running down the gutter, bringing those nutrients right to the river, right? There are numerous things that, you know, it's not always big farmers that set the stage for these issues, right? This was way back farther. There was another graduate student that paired up with a handful of farmers around American Falls to build some wetlands. These farmers had fields that basically would run off directly into the reservoir, into the Snake River, and issues for sure with sediments from the fields and nutrients, right? And so they built a handful of wetlands to basically try to take those nutrients and prevent them from going directly into these waterways to slow that process. In a wetland, it sets the stage for like a massive filter that traps those nutrients and sediments and prevents it from making its way into the big body of water. And it also sets the stage for all sorts of habitat for other things, vegetation and plant, animals, birds, and other things that may have not had suitable habitat. All of a sudden, we find them thriving. And there are definitely some issues with that. So here we can see some dead zones, and we'll just focus on the United States. So these happen when phosphorus and nitrogen cause excessive growth of microbes, and it depletes the oxygen and basically kills off fish and other things, right? We can see some up in the Northwest. So the Columbia River, which is the Snake River in Idaho, as it dumps out, we can see there's issues, but there are bigger issues in the Gulf of Mexico and up the eastern seaboard. But really the Gulf of Mexico, there are massive areas that is a humongous dead zone where stuff just does not grow, right? And this, lots of these areas with nice warm water here because the Caribbean, the currents of the ocean flow up from the equator, cycling through and bringing it this way. The currents flow the other way. So West Coast ocean colder than the East Coast, all right? So lots of suitable habitat for all sorts of organisms in this nice warm water no longer can survive because of all of the eutrophication, all of the dead zones compounding. So we can see a huge area as a result of that. And there are other images where you can see the Mississippi as it dumps into the Gulf with huge swaths of sediment. It's just murky, muddy water as it's dumping in there. That's also a huge issue. These areas were once full of wetlands. There was once massive amounts of area that would take this water, fresh water, as it's coming in, and we would call this mixture of fresh and salt water an estuary, where you get the mixture of the two, and that provides all sorts of good nutrients. It could for a diverse amount of life forms to say, this is perfect, right? And as those wetlands were removed, part of it for human encroachment, habitat, we want this, we want to live there, right? Other parts of it in the Gulf, in the very early 1900s, a lot of the wetlands were drained for mosquito eradication. We wanted to get rid of malaria in the United States. And knowing that swamps and wetlands were prime breeding grounds for these mosquitoes, getting rid of them meant getting rid of malaria. And it also set the stage for huge issues with flooding, hurricanes not being able to be slowed down as they're coming inland, other problems, right? So we can see these issues, and it's not just in the United States. Larger population zones, we can see these problems that set the stage for dead zones. And that is definitely disturbing. So here we can see another, this Chesapeake Bay, where another eutrophication, another dead zone. So we could, let me flip it back, looking right up here, right? More. So this individual, Army Corps engineer, he's got a clump of oysters that they're trying to reintroduce to restore this habitat. There are issues as we think about these and trying to come back from it. As we look at this image, a little of it, we can see big algal blooms, lots and lots of photosynthetic organisms, which initially makes you think that seems good. But with the eutrophication, with all of these nutrients within here, it's not a good situation, and it robs the organisms, the good organisms, of what they truly need to survive, causing bigger problems. So things like, trying to bring situations back to more of a normal, we may think about recognizing problems like runoff and things like that, or possibly wetlands to try to, I guess, sort of mitigate those problems. Here's sulfur as another one. So shifting it away a little bit, the sulfur cycle, sulfur dioxide from the atmosphere becomes available in the ecosystem as it dissolves in precipitation into sulfuric acid, or as it falls back down, like through a volcanic eruption, hydrogen sulfide being spewed out and then coming back down. The sulfates get tapped into, and they also play a role we need these things. It's not as high on the list as things like nitrogen and phosphorus that we looked at, but still important. With that, we can also see issues like this with human emissions, hydrogen sulfide, the burning of fossil fuels releases some of this into the atmosphere. And as the sulfuric acid precipitates down, we call that acid rain. And dependent upon where you're at, there can be some big issues. And a lot of it has to do with how the air is moving. We see more industrialized areas like the East Coast with big steel mills and other factories that have high outputs. And in these areas, bigger issues with acid rain. It causes problems with vegetation. As the acid rain hits it, it can kill those plants. It alters the soil chemistry. So now microbes growing within that soil no longer can persist, potentially changing it. So other things might live that are different, that aren't the native inhabitants. That sets the stage for other problems as well. So it also changes chemistry within the oceans and fresh water as well. And that both bad news. This is a sulfur vent in California with some sulfur deposits. You can see a little bit of it. I mentioned Soda Springs a minute ago. There is a geyser in right downtown Soda Springs that has lots of yellow rock all around it. Pretty impressive. So if you have never seen it, if you pass through Soda, it's worth taking a quick detour just to check it out for a minute. Pretty impressive. Okay, where am I at with this? I think we're at a good stopping point. We will quit right here. We'll pick up with the last half of this Thursday. Any questions or concerns? Okay, guys, have a good day.